Specific learning disability. According to the Individual Disability Education Act, a specific learning disability, or SLD, is a disorder in one or more of the basic psychological processes that help us understand or use language that is written or spoken. An SLD may manifest itself in the inability to listen, think, speak, read, write, or spell. According to the DSM, it is a neural development disorder that impedes the ability to learn or use specific academic skills such as writing, reading, or math, which are the foundations of all other academic learning. If a child has a disorder in one or more of the psychological processes, which are considered to be perception, learning, language, thought, attention, memory, motivation, and emotion, they can have difficulties that can cause problems in all learning subjects, from history to science, and in everyday activities. Students that are diagnosed with an SLD do not make adequate progress to meet age or grade level standards. Students may also show a pattern of strengths and weaknesses that is relative to age. Many times a student's underachievement is unexpected, which can also be a sign of an SLD. In many cases, a student with an SLD usually has average or above average intellectual ability. So to help you understand better, a student who is usually diagnosed with an SLD, when their achievement is not matching up with what they are capable of, is usually a sign that they have some sort of learning disability. Students with SLDs process things differently, which causes them to struggle in many academic areas, or certain academic areas. Students may also have other disabilities that can affect their performance, such as ADHD or communication impairments, but these are not actually considered SLDs. They may just adversely affect a student's educational performance. It's also important to know that not all children with ADHD experience learning difficulties, and children who have other primarily disabling conditions, such as visual impairments, hearing impairments, motor disabilities, or even emotional disturbances, will not qualify under a specific learning disability. Students also will not be found eligible for a specific learning disability if the detriment factor is due to a lack of instruction or a lack of the English language. An SLD affects a student's ability to read, write, speak, reason, or do math. There are 4 major academic areas where a student can show a sign of weakness. If you notice up here, reading, writing, math, and language are the 4 main academic areas where they can show weakness. In reading, students can struggle with basic reading skills, reading fluency, and reading comprehension. In writing, they can struggle with written expression. In math, they can struggle with math calculations or math problem-solving skills. And in language, they can show frustration or weakness in oral expression or listening comprehension. It's important to know that students' disabilities in these areas can vary, and they can also be seen in multiple areas. So students may show a learning disability in reading and math, or some students may show a specific learning disability just in math. Manifestations. Specific learning disabilities usually manifest themselves in elementary school or lower grades, because that's when the demands of the student become greater and more overwhelming, and the gap between the intellect and the ability grows. Signs of an SLD could be difficulty learning the alphabet, difficulty reading out loud. Students could read fluently, but they might not understand what they're reading. Students struggling to write. Students having difficulty understanding directions orally or information orally. In preschool, sometimes students holding a pencil incorrectly would be a sign of a specific learning disability. Having difficulty with simple computations and having difficulty with math word problems. These are all signs and red flags that would demonstrate that a student may have a specific learning disability. Learning disorders are diagnosed after formal education begins. Students must have difficulties for over 6 months in the academic areas that were just shown, in the areas of reading, spelling, writing, or math. Students' progress must also significantly be much lower than what is expected of the child's age. And it's important to make sure that no other conditions are affecting the child from succeeding. Diagnoses are made through observations, interviews, family history, school reports. Neuropsychological testing may also be used to find the best way to help with an SLD as well. Once all the assessments and the evaluation and measures have been completed, parents will receive a report and with explanations, and a team of teachers and school counselors, the child study team, will all meet together to determine what the next steps are and determine eligibility. Students who are eligible for special ed services due to a specific learning disability will qualify for an individualized education plan. This is also known as an IEP. An IEP is a legal document that is devised so a child can reach his or her full potential. Efforts are always made to have the child in the least restrictive environment. So if a child can succeed in a general ed classroom, they will be kept there, incorporating accommodations and modifications that will help them. If a child needs to be in a smaller setting, they may be recommended to be in a pull-out setting, which this is where this child will be put into a smaller classroom with fewer kids, and accommodations and modifications in that smaller classroom will help them succeed. It is important to know that a child can be in a pull-out for reading, but also in a general ed classroom for math, or vice versa. Assessing the student's strengths and weaknesses is the best way to develop the most effective IEP. As you can see, these are the guiding principles to IEP development, and an IEP is always developed with the child in mind. The IEP is always shared responsibility between the student, the parents, and the school, and the general education curriculum is always the goal in order to keep the child in the general ed classroom. However, if modifications and accommodations need to be made in order for this, for the child to be successful, those accommodations and modifications will be put into the IEP. Again, the IEP is always based on the individual's strengths and the individual's needs, and of course, the individual is always put in the least restrictive environment. All goals are always set for future, and it is important to know that annual IEP meetings are held to reassess and assess the modifications and accommodations that are put in place, and testing will take place every 3 years to determine if the student still qualifies for special education under a specific learning disability. There are differences between accommodations and modifications, and both can be seen in the IEP. Accommodations change how the student learns the material. Modifications change what the student is learning. It's important to understand that because many of the times, again, the IEP will contain accommodations because they want the least restrictive environment. It's important to know that accommodations can help a child that may have A-worthy ideas in their head, but they may not be able to write it on paper. So accommodations like speech-to-text technology would benefit a child who has an SLD in this area. Other examples of accommodations might be extended time, preferential seating, seating away from noises or distractions, or maybe sitting close to a teacher, reading directions orally, or maybe having the child give you verbal responses instead of written responses, or even having them be able to tell you what they know the answer is, and you're grading them on content more than accuracy. So not taking points off for like capitalization, punctuation, and incomplete sentences. Modifications, on the other hand, are a little different. Modifications can be seen either in the classroom setting or in test-taking settings. Some examples of modifications might be open book tests or open note tests, giving untimed tests. Other examples of modifications might be giving different versions of the test. So maybe a student might struggle with word bank tests, giving them multiple choice tests with maybe a answer choice taken away would help a student succeed. The use of a calculator during math testing may help a student. So that student may have a hard time adding up the numbers, but they know how to solve the word problems, so the use of the calculator will help them succeed. And giving a child frequent breaks in between testing will also help the child be successful. Over 2.8 million students are being served for SLDs. That is almost half, approximately 47.4% that receive special education services for SLDs. Discovering SLDs earlier on is crucial in preventing students entering the middle and high school from not having those essential literacy skills that are needed. So the later on that a student is diagnosed with an SLD, the more they're going to struggle later on in life. This pie chart shows on the baby blue shows you the percentage of students that are actually who have a specific learning disability. And if you notice, the second highest disability where students receive special education services for are speech and language students. This graph shows the differences amongst races and ethnicities that are diagnosed with learning disabilities. As you can see, Native Americans' percentage of being served special education services for learning disabilities are at 18%. This is actually higher than those students who are white, Black, or Hispanic who are also receiving special education services for learning disabilities. Black students and white students are at 14% and Black students are at 16%, and Hispanic students are at 13% for receiving special education services for learning disabilities. There's also a discrepancy between boys and girls, whether or not boys are more diagnosed with specific learning disabilities, or girls are more diagnosed with specific learning disabilities. Some studies say that boys have more learning disabilities than girls, but other studies have shown that teachers actually just recommend boys more so for testing because they show more of the visible signs of SLDs, such as inattentiveness or signs of ADHD that can affect a student's learning, which actually could show up as a specific learning disability. And boys usually tend to show more frustration in class, like these physical signs, whereas girls more so kind of hold these frustrations internally. So there really is no study out there that tells you whether or not boys are more diagnosed with SLDs over girls. And lastly, according to the National Survey of Children's Health, children in poverty are more than twice as likely to be identified with an SLD. And many believe this is because many of these children are born into poverty, which can also result in low birth weight. They also are born into situations where there could be other environmental factors that can cause stress that affects the neurodevelopment in ways that can make it harder to control their emotions and harder for them to learn certain skills that are needed in these academic areas. So as you can see, this is just a little summary of what a specific learning disability is. It pretty much sums up what I talked about in regards to specific learning disabilities. SLDs are a processing disorder where students are unable to fully reach their potential in spelling, reading, writing, thinking, and math.